Join me again in Nehemiah chapter 9 as we've been proceeding through this rather lengthy prayer. Starts back in verse 5 and it ends all the way in verse 38. We've been taking it section by section. And last Sunday we saw things, discovered things, astounding things about God and astounding things about people. And we will continue today, Lord willing, to discover more astounding things about God. But we left off in verse 21, and I want to read verse 21 again and start there. Indeed, 40 years you provided for them in the wilderness, and they were not in want. Their clothes did not wear out, nor did their feet swell. He provided for them in the wilderness for 40 years. Well, I want to rewind here to former days, similar to Hebrews chapter 11. The writer there, you know, that faith chapter, says this person's faith, that person's faith, and he recounts. And when we looked at Hebrews chapter 11, it provided us plenty of opportunities to go back and actually see what happened when he talked about by faith the walls of Jericho fell and things like that. And so we did it. It provided an opportunity for some retro reading in the Bible. And so I want to do that again here today. And we'll be reading passages, looking back on them. But here, this is mentioned, the wilderness for 40 years. And I want to say some things in regard to the wilderness before we go further in the text. You remember 40 years in the wilderness, what was that for? Why did that happen? It happened because the nation made it from Egypt all the way to the land of Canaan, and they refused to enter in. By faith, they refused to enter in. Their unbelief kept them out of the rest. And God disciplined them by turning them around, sending them back into the wilderness for 40 years. The spies had given a bad report and caused the hearts of the people to melt, and they lost courage, and they refused to go in and possess the land that God had given to them, promised to them. And so their unbelief banned them from the land flowing with milk and honey. And everyone 20 years old and older, that represent the fighting group of Israel, that entire generation of unbelievers died off in the wilderness during these 40 years described here, except for two. You remember those two, Joshua and Caleb. They were two of the spies that gave the good report, and God blessed them for that. But in Numbers chapter 14, Moses recounts some of this, and he says, quoting God here, "But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in the wilderness, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and shall suffer for your faithlessness until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness." That was God's discipline. According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear your iniquity 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. So that was one thing that was accomplished, 40 years wandering in the wilderness. That generation was punished for their unbelief. But there was something else that was accomplished in the wilderness wanderings, if you want to call them that, and that was another generation was raised up to possess the land. God didn't abandon his people. Deuteronomy 1 says, "As for your little ones, who you said would become a prey, And your children, who today have no knowledge of good or evil, they shall go in there. And to them I will give it, and they shall possess it. So 2 things accomplished, 40 years of wandering. One, that previous generation punished, died off. They never got to see the land. 2, the next generation was raised up in the wilderness, and they were the ones that possessed the land. In the wilderness wanderings for 40 years. The ones that were shepherds during those 40 years. The children who suffered for their parents' faithlessness for 40 years in the wilderness. They were raised up. So the way by which God often leads his people can be described as the way of the wilderness. You and I. Are we in a wilderness right now? We're on our way to our promised inheritance. Seems to me that it could fit. Look around you. This world is a wilderness, and it's easily compared to that. Well, God raises up a generation of people to take the land in the wilderness. Whenever they left the land of Egypt in Exodus 13, when Pharaoh let the people go, it's recounted to us there, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although it was near. For God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return back to Egypt, but God led the people around by the way of the wilderness. Wilderness. So apart from God's purpose to punish that generation who didn't believe, there are several points of similarity between the journey of Israel from Egypt to Canaan and the path of God's people through this world, you and I, today. Life is often like a long wilderness. You know, God has promised us to take us to heaven, but he hasn't promised that it'll be the easy and shortest way. It's often a wilderness. Moses, you recall, he spent his early years in the palace of Pharaoh. That prepared him, obviously, for dealing with Pharaoh later. But also, remember, after he killed that Egyptian, he fled Egypt and he spent 40 years in the wilderness until God met him in the wilderness at the burning bush and commissioned him to go back. 40 years of wilderness preparation. Isn't that amazing how God does that? He prepared him for the courts of Pharaoh early in his life, and then he prepared him for the hardships of shepherding a people through a wilderness by being a shepherd for Jethro, his father-in-law, in the wilderness. It's amazing to me to look at things like that. Joseph, the course of his life, it was full of trouble and distress. From the time they threw him into the pit until the time he reached the palace, it was by way of the prison. And the Bible tells us God tried him by his word those years in prison. He was tested by God. John the Baptist, where did he come from? Not the local university. He came from the wilderness, dressed in leather and eating locusts and wild honey. He came from a wilderness preparation that prepared him for thundering out the gospel fearlessly. Our Lord himself, he returned from his baptism. The Bible tells us the Spirit led him into the wilderness for 40 days to be tempted by the devil. Well, so it is in our lives. The course of providence sometimes takes strange turns. And our path is seldom what we once, at one time, thought that it would be. Look back on your life. The journey from Egypt to Canaan, it was not what the Israelites expected. That without a doubt, they longed for the promised land, but the nearest way is not always the best way, but God's way is the best way. Well, here they were in the wilderness for 40 years. Those were needy times. They didn't have any provisions. They didn't have any food, any water, but God provided those things in the wilderness for them. They met with many dangers in the wilderness. One place says, God led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water. They met with dangers in the wilderness, but God protected them. They needed a guide through the unknown. The wilderness is disorienting. And so he gave them that pillar of cloud. It was pretty simple for them. When the cloud rises and moves, you follow. Pack up camp and follow it. He led them. He guided them. They needed light. At night, they had that pillar of fire. They needed shade in the day. They had that cloud to provide shade cover because the wilderness is cold at night and hot during the day. God provided all of that for them in the wilderness. They needed assurance of God's presence with them. That cloud, that pillar gave them that. Oftentimes, we need reassurance. He gave His good spirit. They needed endurance, we just read. Their clothes didn't wear out. Their feet didn't swell. That was supernatural right there. In another place, Moses said, your sandals have not worn off your feet. That's 40 years out of one pair of shoes. Not too many of us could get that, I'd say. It's supernatural. Well, in the next generation, the children of the unbelievers, they grew up in that wilderness right there. There were some that were born in that wilderness that were now 40 years old and ready to take the land of Canaan. They were disciplined. They took possession to take possession of the land. And we see as we read on God's astounding generosity. First, He gives them military success. Let's read further here in verse 22. You also gave them kingdoms and peoples and allotted them to them as a boundary. The ESV says every corner. You allotted to them every corner. And they took possession of the land of Sihon, the king of Heshbon, and the land of Og, the king of Bashan. Here's military success. And it's continuing the fulfillment of God's purpose and His promise all along. Those things are unchanged. The first generation refused to enter in. Did God's purpose change? Did His plan change? His promise? It was still the promised land. No, He removed that generation of unbelievers and raised up another generation, and His purpose goes on. That's God. So we have a statement in 22a. You also gave them kingdoms and peoples and allotted to them every corner. That's a statement. And then in 22b, he elaborates on that. The details are given. They took possession of the land of Sihon, the king of Heshbon, and the land of Og, the king of Bashan. Now we have the fall of Sihon, king of Heshbon, and of Og, king of Bashan here. And those guys, I don't know if they mean much to you, if you even remember their names when you've read through the Bible. I don't know, but these are two kings with fearful reputations. These two kings represent the last of the giants of the land. And the conquest of these two kingdoms is named first, partly because this was at the very beginning of the conquest of the land of Canaan. In fact, the kingdoms of these two kings are on the east side of the Jordan River. And the land of Canaan is on the west side of the Jordan River. And you recall whenever under Joshua, the Jordan River parted, was stopped up, and crossed on dry ground, remember that? And then they encountered the first city of Jericho. Well, this is before that, these two kings right here. And it's significant. I want you to realize the significance of it. So we're going to go back, I said, to Deuteronomy. Let's go back to Deuteronomy. And we'll see what happened there. In Deuteronomy chapter 2. And we'll take up the reading in this portion in verse 24. Arise, set out, and pass through the valley of Arnon. Look, I've given Sihon the Amorite, king of Heshbon, and his land into your hand. Begin to take possession and contend with him in battle. This day I will begin to put the dread and fear of you upon the peoples, everywhere under the heavens, who when they hear the report of you shall tremble and be in anguish because of you. In other words, what's going to happen here is going to be so signally impressive that everybody else you come up against is going to look back at that and say, man, we're in big trouble. 26, so I sent messengers from the wilderness of Kedemoth to Sihon, king of Heshbon, with words of peace, saying, let me pass through your land, and I'll travel only on the highway. I will not turn aside to the right or the left. And you will sell me food for money, so that I may eat, and give me water for money, so that I may drink. Only let me pass through on foot. In other words, this could be a good opportunity for you to make some money here. Just as the sons of Esau who lived in Seir and the Moabites who live in Ar did for me, until I cross over the Jordan into the land which the Lord our God is giving to us. But Sihon, king of Heshbon, was not willing for us to pass through his land. For the Lord your God hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate in order to deliver him into your hand, as he is today. And the Lord said to me, see, I've begun to deliver Sihon and his land over to you. Begin to occupy so that you may possess his land. Then Sihon with all his people came out to meet us in battle at Jahaz. And the Lord our God delivered him over to us, and we defeated him with his sons and all his people. So we captured all his cities at that time, and utterly destroyed the men, women, and children of every city. We left no survivor. We took only the animals as our booty and the spoil of the cities which we had captured, from Arar, which is on the edge of the valley of Arnon, and from the city which is in the valley, even to Gilead. There was no city that was too high for us. And the Lord our God delivered all over to us. This is the fall of the king of Sihon here, that the prayer in Nehemiah is referring to. You remember when God said to Abraham, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete? He said it's going to be 4 generations from now until your people possess the land. That's this right here, these Amorites. Sihon is the king of the Amorites. Well, what about this guy Og of Bashan? He even sounds like a giant, doesn't he? Og. His name, you probably don't realize it. I didn't until I studied this out. His name appears in 6 books of the Bible, and 22 times he's referred to. Og of Bashan. And the battle is the battle of Edrei. And we find that by turning over just one chapter in Deuteronomy to chapter 3. And the reading there in verse 1. Then we turned and went up the road to Bashan, And Og, king of Bashan, with all his people, came out to meet us in battle at Edrei. But the Lord said to me, do not fear him, for I've delivered him and all his people and his land into your hands, and you shall do to him just as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon. So the Lord our God delivered Og also, king of Bashan, with all his people into our hand, and we smote them until no survivor was left. And we captured all his cities at that time. There was not a city which we did not take from them. 60 cities, all the region of Argob, the kingdom of Og in Bashan. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? And all these cities were fortified cities with high walls, gates and bars, besides a great many unwalled towns. You remember, incidentally, I insert it right here, part of the report from those spies initially was, we don't stand a chance. All of those cities are high fortified cities with walls to the heavens, they said. And giants in the land. We're like grasshoppers to them. You remember all of that? Well, that's this right here. All of these cities fortified with high walls and gates and bars. I was reading one commentator that was commenting on this very kingdom of Og here, and he said some of those cities with their walls are still there. And some of the doors, big slabs of stone that swing and pivot on hinges made out of stone, are still there. And they're big and huge. That's interesting to me. I'm kind of a historian that way. But he says in verse 6, we utterly destroyed them as we did to Sihon, king of Heshbon, utterly destroying the men, women, and children of every city, but all the animals and the spoil of the cities we took as our booty. Thus we took the land at that time from the hand of the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, from the valley of Arnon to Mount Hermon. Sidonians call Hermon Sirion, and the Amorites call it Sinir. And all of the cities of the plateau, and all Gilead, and all Bashan, as far as Salakai, Ka, and Edrei, cities of the kingdom of Og in Bashan. And then he inserts a parenthetical statement here in verse 11. For only Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Those were giants. And behold, his bedstead was an iron bedstead, and it's in Rabbah of the sons of Ammon, and its length was 9 cubits, and its width 4 cubits by ordinary cubit. That is 13.5 feet long and 6 feet wide for his bed. Now, isn't it interesting that the Bible gives you that little bit of detail right there? I'm thankful for that. They're saying, when we took this guy, we kept his bed. We kept his bed as a reminder, as a testimony, as a witness to the fact that we were able to do this by the power of our God. And his bed is over here. They even tell you, you could go over here and see it. That amazes me. So we took possession of this land at that time from Arar, which is by the valley of the Arnon, and half the hill country of the Gilead and its cities I gave to the Reubenites, to the Gadites, the rest of Gilead, and all Bashan, the kingdom of Og, I gave to the half-tribe of Manasseh. All the region of Argob concerning all Bashan, and it is called the land of Rephaim. So those were the 2, what we would call Transjordanian tribes, 3 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. And they settled on the east of the Jordan. They got the king of Heshbon and the king of Bashan, their kingdoms. they got. 60 cities in all just for Og. Now look here at verse 2 of this chapter. The Lord said to me, do not fear him. Why would he fear him? He's a giant. He's got a reputation. Do not fear him, he says. I've given him and all his people and his land in your hand, and you shall do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites. So here's the encouragement of God for his people. He says, do not fear him. And it's based on a promise. I've given him to you. And it's based on their past experience. You'll do to him just like you did to Sihon. Now that's for us today. God promised to us heaven, the land, take it, take possession of the land. He's promised that to us. And we look at our past experience, we've seen that he's never failed us to this point ever. Look at the conquests up until now in your own personal lives. We've heard the Ebenezer. He's helped us thus far. So he assured them of the victory, God did. And it would be a compound victory. Because you did this to Sihon, this is what you'll do also to Og. And that battle that was won against Sihon surely must have fueled their courage and their confidence in God that he would do what he said he would do. He gave them that land. And there's a principle here, and that is God advances his kingdom, and Christ advances his church in the world, and it marches against all opposition. God does it for his people and for his name's sake. God's people overcome because he gives them the victory. We have that in the New Testament. We're more than conquerors through him who loved us. That's God's people, conquerors. Well, how did he give them this land of Og, king of Bashan, with his cities walled to the heavens, 60 cities? We're not given any details about the conquest of that. I wish we were, as kind of a historical buff. I wish he would have given us some of these cities, how it happened. But it didn't happen the usual way. It didn't happen by a siege. We're not told there was some long, drawn-out siege. Jerusalem, it took 2.5 years of siege before they starved the people out. We're not told that happened here. So I wonder how that all came about. Well, Joshua gives us one little detail. And it's interesting, in Joshua 24 and verse 12, God is recounting through Joshua to the people. And he says this, then I sent the hornet before you and drove out the 2 kings of the Amorites from before you, but not by your sword or your bow. So they got there, and God had already sent hornets. And the hornets were doing battle for them. That's how I understand all this. Sometimes it's a strange providence God uses to give the victory, but he does. And who can stand before a people whose God commands the hornets? The next verse in Joshua 24 says, I gave you a land on which you'd not labored and cities which you'd not built, and you lived in them. So I think that's a bit of detail right there against these 2 kings, Sihon and Og. God even sent hornets to drive them out. That's quite a thought. A small hornet. I mean, even if it's a big hornet, it's not any bigger than that. But you send swarms of them, and what are giants going to do? So that turned the playing field, I would have to say, in favor of God's people. And that was apparently one strange providence by way of which God gave them this land on the Transjordanian side of the river. Now, all of that makes for good reading, and it's very imaginative. It provokes your imagination, thinking of things like this. But what did that do right there? The conquest of the king of Sihon and the king of Og. It established a reputation for God and for God's people from then on. There are several references in the Bible to it. Think of Rahab in Joshua 2 and verse 10. She told the spies, "We've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt. We heard about that. And what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. We heard that too." And when we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and earth beneath. God made a reputation for himself with these cities and these conquests. That was Rahab recounting. Well, in Joshua chapter 9 and verse 9, the Gibeonites, they came, supposedly from a faraway land with ratty clothes and worn out shoes and crusty old bread, and they said, we're here, we want to make an allegiance with you, we're from a faraway place. Well, it was all a deception, but they said this. They said, "We heard the report of him," God, "and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites, which were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon, king of Heshbon, to Og, king of Bashan, who was at Ashtaroth." That's another report. They heard about it too. You see, this is fulfilling what God told the nation. I'm going to put the fear of you on everybody. Well, you get to the book of Psalms, and in Psalm 135, we read these words, "He smote many nations and slew many kings." This is a psalm of praise. Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan, all the way to the psalmist. "And all the kingdoms of Canaan, and he gave their land as a heritage to Israel, his people." And a number of weeks ago, Joe gave an exhortation on Psalm 136. You recall it, at least this fact in regard to that psalm. Every single verse in the entire psalm ends with, "His love, steadfast love, endures forever." Well, stuck in the middle of that Psalm 136 is this, "And he killed mighty kings, Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan." Why? For his steadfast love endures forever. It's a matter of praise. So not only was it a matter of a fearful report paving the way for a conquest, it's a matter of praise, even for the psalmist. And you get to Nehemiah, where we are looking at this prayer, and the prayer recounts, again, the taking of the possession of the land of Sihon and the land of the king of Bashan. Now, it's a comfort to remember this right here. The Lord is the Lord of nations. Kingdoms rise, kingdoms fall, all under his control. And we live in a world right now where you can't escape it in the news. Battles here, wars, rumors of wars, kingdoms rising, kingdoms falling, kingdoms attacking one another, kingdoms invading one another, and all of the terrorism in the backdrop of all of that. We've got Sihon and Og conquered by God, conquered by his people, because he controls it all to accomplish his purpose and his promise. The land of one nation is conquered, and it becomes another nation's possession. And in the midst of wars and rumors of wars, it's the Lord Jesus who says the end is not yet. He controls it all. We should remember that song that we sing, "This is my Father's world." The battle's not yet done. Jesus who died will be satisfied. Daniel says he changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He does that still today. Whatever the Lord pleases, he does in heaven and in earth. So this land was given by God to his people, and it was conquered by men. They had to go up and do the battle. They had to go up and take it. But God gave it to them. And he did whatever he needed to do to turn battles in their favor so that they were able to conquer it. God promised the land, but they had to fight and possess it. So here we are today, we could say, in the way of imagery, in the way of analogy, this life of ours is a life, a wilderness life. We're on our way to the promised land. God has promised heaven for everyone who believes. The sky, not the grave, is our goal, we sang. So along that way, never lose sight of the fact that God is the one in control of all of these things, even the big ones. And as he did for them, he does for his people still today. And he has established his reputation in the world, his renown, he's famous for these things, even today. Our Bibles are open before us, and what are we doing? We're reading about this king, Sihon, and this king Og today, and marveling at it. He's still getting glory for having done that for them today. And he will see us all the way to the end. The battle's not done. We're not there yet. Some of us are closer than others. But yet we go on by faith. We don't waver in unbelief like the first generation did, refusing to go in. But we go on in faith as God's people to take our promised land. Well, amen. That's all for today.